to realize that the prosecution, the conviction rate in federal court is like something like 95, 97%.
You're right. I mean,
yeah.
that's the other thing that's worth mentioning. I mean, the weight of the U.S. government's boot heel in criminal prosecutions is enormous, and for the most part, most people won't want to fight that. And I think the overall prosecution rate for terrorism cases is even higher. And so, if you're facing these kind of charges, it's a pretty daunting thing, especially since these charges come with, as I mentioned, pretty draconian mandatory minimum sentences. So if you choose to fight it, and you lose, you're going to be punished enormously and face decades of your life in prison.
And even trying to drum up support, like even your own family and your friends and stuff like that, they don't want to be accused of being disloyal or un-American or unpatriotic, and they kind of vanish,
Absolutely. I mean, there is nothing more damning, I don't think, than having the U.S. government call you a terrorist, right? I mean, the word terrorism, you could argue, has been like so kind of so politicized and used so frequently, its meaning is sometimes meaningless. But that said, I mean, I think from what most people agree, what a terrorist means, when the U.S. government charges you with that, I think most people would side with the government and say, well, this guy must be a really bad dude. And I think that there isn't much of a healthy debate and talk about a lot of these cases. And so I think for a lot of these defendants, they have trouble gaining support. They have trouble raising legal funds because no one really wants to be able to support the guy who's a terrorist, right? Mm-hmm. And in that same vein, I mean, it also makes my research very difficult because I'll tell you, the best stories for a journalist to write about injustice are the ones where it's the main character is this really sympathetic guy and you feel for him because he's just like you. And the truth is that the people that are caught up in these sting operations, while not the terrorists that the government describes, are often pretty odious people. They say things that are anti-Semitic or they praise, violence against innocent people. And so they're not exactly the types that you'd want to bring over and have over for dinner and meet your family. And so they're not sympathetic in that way, and that makes writing about them difficult. But at the same time, I think it's a really important story because, it's cases like that and defendants like that where the government is able to abuse its power. And if it's able to keep abusing its power, eventually that abuse is going to apply, to the people like you and me, to the more sympathetic people.
Interesting you bring that up because I know that one of the heads of the Jewish Defense League is in prison right now. And I think he cut his throat and he jumped over the rail. And it was a similar kind of case like this where there was a plot, a quote-unquote plot, but there was no explosives, there was nothing. He was plotting to blow up mosques, and they threw him in federal prison. Now, have you looked into that case?
No, I don't know much about this case at all, actually, I'm sad to say.
Yeah, well, and the thing is, so that was part of my question, though, is because have you noticed that the targets of these things are all like Muslims?
By and large, they are, but you're right. They're not all Muslims. We are seeing kind of an evolution, or kind of a movement of these tactics to other groups. One of the larger groups that we're seeing its use in is environmental activists and so-called anarchists. There was a plot a few years ago to bomb a bridge over the Cuyahoga River in Ohio involving 4 environmental activists, and it used the same type of tactics. In fact, ironically, one of the 4 had mental illness, like a lot of the Muslim defendants, and the same type of tactics were used, and it was described as eco-terrorism. There was a very well-known case out of California involving a man named Eric McDavid who was caught up in a sting and actually was just released because it was discovered that that he and the informant were passing notes that suggested that there was a burgeoning sexual relationship between the two, and obviously that was problematic because the informant was basically using her feminine wiles, for lack of a better term, to get him to move along in the plot in a way that was improper, if not illegal, and he ultimately negotiated a release as part of that. And so we are seeing these in more and more areas, and I would say that is the troubling aspect of this, is that as the government kind of codifies this more as a tool in its toolbox, it's not only going to use it in counterterrorism cases involving Muslims, it's going to find more and more areas to use it, and how that ultimately shakes out and how it affects Americans is something to be concerned about. And that's why I think this is a really good story about justice, because I think, it is a tactic that eventually may affect you. And so, now is the time to kind of call out these bad tactics before they receive wider adoption. But at this point, I mean, the sad thing to say is that, despite my criticism and despite criticism from other media and organizations like Human Rights Watch, the government really has no reason to back down from this at this point. The courts are upholding these types of cases, and Congress, which is the other oversight of the FBI, has so far been unwilling to provide any kind of meaningful oversight or even any hearings that question these tactics.
Yeah, that answers a question that we had in the chat room way early on in the program. Someone was asking, well, are any of these FBI agents being prosecuted for this?
Yeah, the answer is no. Right now, what the FBI doing isn't illegal per se. They are building cases, and then they are giving them to the courts, and the courts are upholding them. I think there are two areas of weakness in the oversight. I mean, one is that by and large, the federal bench hasn't been willing to challenge these cases, and it has allowed a lot of leeway in some of these cases. There have been several examples in cases where the government showed evidence to a judge that it didn't show to the defense lawyers claiming national security privilege. And then there are a number of examples, I think, where judges have been unwilling to push back on these cases for whatever reason, whether they don't want to be seen as weak on terrorism, or they hope to be appointed to the federal appellate bench, maybe even the Supreme Court, and they don't want to have to answer why it was that they were weak on 4 guys who were plotting to bomb synagogues in the Bronx, for example. The other issue, of course, is Congress, right? Congress has a number of committees and subcommittees with the authority to haul in the FBI director and ask questions and subpoena documents. And so far, they've been unwilling to do that. There has yet to be a single hearing on these cases. My cynical view is that, politically, it's very difficult for a congressional official to win re-election, seeming like he's questioning, the premier law enforcement agency's counterterrorism policy and seen as weak on counterterrorism. But even that, even when there have been some congressional action. So the one exception I can think of where the Congress kind of acted with some teeth was when it did call a hearing that looked at the intelligence failures around the Boston Marathon bombings. And the FBI director was subpoenaed to show up to that hearing and just chose not to. And nothing happened to him. He wasn't found in contempt of Congress or anything. And so I think there's a clear track record now that the FBI is able to do this type of work without the fear of a pushback from the courts or the Congress, which are really the only areas that or the only institutions that keep the FBI and keep the FBI's power in check.
I wasn't aware of that, about the FBI agent not showing up to a congressional subpoena.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
The FBI, officials from the Boston Police Department and other Boston, Massachusetts law enforcement agencies testified, and the FBI was invited to come and chose not to attend.
I want to back up a little bit, though, here, because you were saying about how there was a case where the prosecutors didn't turn over discovery to the defense lawyers. Now, was this you're saying that the judge said that was okay?
No. So this was a case recently involving an environmental activist or anarchist named Eric McDavid, and he was prosecuted in an informant-led sting operation where they allegedly plotted to bomb a number of targets in Northern California. And his defense, in part, was that the informant, who was a young woman, had basically, kind of promised that they would have a sexual relationship if he moved forward in the plot with her, and basically that he was manipulated because of his sexual attraction and interest in a relationship with her. And Eric McDavid's family and friends after his conviction, kept FOIAing documents from the government. And what was really fascinating was that either by luck or just happenstance, one of the FOIA requests returned a bunch of documents that should have been turned over to Eric McDavid's defense. And these included emails that he had written that showed that there was this kind of flirtation happening between the informant and the target as the sting was happening. And there was also other kind of FBI documents that were clearly Brady material that were not turned over. And ultimately, as a result of that discovery, Eric McDavid was released as part of a negotiated deal. And that happened about maybe 6 months ago now.
Oh, really? Okay. That's interesting. Should I get them on?
Yeah, no, he'd be a great guest for you.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I just had the guy from, I forget his last name, but that guy Leslie from upstate New York was part of the Earth Liberation Front. And he's been under surveillance for like 20 years. And a young guy, too. And anyway, we just had him on recently. Now, some of these other cases, these big cases, like the shoe bomber and the underwear bomber, right?
Right.
Now, they seem to fall into the same kind of pattern as well, but these guys actually had bombs. Yeah, like and don't you kind of find that if it's sort of like an overseas operation, that maybe the same tactics would be used, and in those cases they would kind of give them the explosives as well, real ones?
So there is really like a separate kind of two separate areas, I would say. So the underwear bomber and the shoe bomber were two men who had come from overseas, had connections to international terrorist groups that had helped them put these bombs together. And so, that clearly is a threat to the United States to some degree, that you would have someone like that try to smuggle on explosives to an airplane. The difference is that the difficulty of bringing in kind of an operative from overseas into the United States and having him become operational is significantly more difficult. I mean, this is even kind of in the admission of groups like Al-Qaeda. And so as a result of that, what they've tried to do, and this gets at the other area that I talk about, and the one that I write about more frequently, is that Al-Qaeda and its affiliate groups kind of in the last decade, realizing that their capacity to send over trained terrorists as they did on 9/11 is almost impossible. What they're trying to do is inspire an attack of a so-called lone wolf terrorist. So what they're hoping to find is someone who is in the United States already, likely a U.S. citizen, who sympathizes with their views and will read some of their material or watch some of their videos and then plot an attack on his own. And then once he does that, Al-Qaeda or whichever group can claim credit and say, yes, he was working inspired by us. And so that's the great threat that U.S. government officials are primarily concerned about in the U.S. In fact, if the FBI officials have said this in congressional testimony, that they are less concerned about the possibility of someone coming in from overseas and more concerned about someone already in the United States becoming inspired to commit an attack and then pulling it off. And so but unlike, say, a Richard Reed or the underwear bomber, these men don't have connections to the international terrorist groups. They likely don't even have a way of contacting them, and their ability to put together a bomb as a result is significantly lowered and possibly even non-existent. And yet the FBI is trying to stop them before they strike, and so that's really the difference. I mean, there's someone like the underwear bomber and the shoe bomber obviously had capacity. They got on a plane and they had an explosive device. The guys that they're catching in the sting operations, by contrast, are really, and this is a government term, more aspirational than operational. These are people who, want to do something, but, their ability to do it, is not particularly high.
Okay, but would you agree, though, that the FBI's motive and that the government's motive in setting up these sting operations is to kind of put the public in kind of in fear and say, hey, look, we're here to protect you. You need to increase our budget, and we need to spy on you some more. Just go along with the program, because look what these bad guys we're saving you from.
Right. So I would tend to agree with that viewpoint. I would say in the FBI's view, what they are doing as a result of these things is creating what they term a hostile environment for real terrorists. So the same thing happened, and this is the same kind of tactic that was used against the mafia in the 1980s, and which is to say that you recruit so many informants and you announce all of these cases with great fanfare that you become a part of the chatter of the mafia. And so the next time a mafioso